So let's jump into Joannides and the updated Joannides file
Yeah,
that you recently
yeah,
acquired. So again, I just say, critics say that there's not a smoking gun, it's a nothing burger, but and it's true. There's no direct evidence that Joannides directed Bringuier to act with Oswald, but that ignores all these other little tidbits. Like, for example, lying to the CIA that Joannides wasn't involved in the case at all when he actually was the DRE handler, and he's also, the CIA's liaison for the HSCA. All of Joannides' progress reports for 17 relevant months are missing. I found that to be a huge fact. Joannides was sent a tape of Oswald debating Bringuier in his role as the HSCA head, and he never mentioned it to the HSCA that he had been sent that. Sent the
yeah.
tape.
This argument, oh, there's nothing there. I mean, let's go through and look at what's there. Okay, so there's no proof that Joannides ordered the DRE to publicize Oswald. No, there's no proof, but we do know what happened, right? Joannides was paying the leaders of the DRE $51,000 a month in cash to generate three things: propaganda, political action, and intelligence collection. That's what's in Joannides' job report for 1963. Those were his duties from the Cuban Student Directorate: intelligence collection, political action, and propaganda. Okay, so when the DRE chapter in New Orleans runs into Oswald, they deliver on what they're being paid to do on all three counts. They collect intelligence, they send it back to the Miami headquarters. They engage in political action, they confront Oswald on the street, they denounce him, they confront him in the courtroom, they denounce him in the press report, and they generate propaganda. They issue a press release. So they do all that 3 months before the assassination. And that's what they're getting paid to do. After the assassination, they use the intelligence they've collected to engage in political action and generate propaganda to say that the man who just killed the president is a Castro supporter. Okay. Joannides paid for that too. So he paid for these activities, and he had no objection when they engaged in them. So he approved it. I mean, there's no other way, there's no other possible explanation. The idea that the DRE did all of these things and Joannides didn't know about it, well, if his monthly reports, which he was required to file a monthly report on each group every month. If he filed a report and said, I didn't know about this or it wasn't important, but Joannides never did that. He never filed the reports. So
Right.
so he approved what they were doing. He paid for it. They did what they were paid for, and he approved of it afterwards. So the idea he didn't know about it,
Uh-huh.
I mean, you can say that, but did Joannides ever say he didn't know about it? No. And he had every opportunity, right? There's the other thing. If he didn't know about it, when he was talking to the House Select Committee 15 years later, he could have said, God, I didn't know anything about that guy Oswald, or I knew a little bit about him, but I didn't take him seriously. I figured he was a lone nut. There's nothing like that on the record. This is another one of those JFK theories that has no evidence to support it. Nobody in the CIA literature, and many people have written their memoirs, have ever said, God, we were all over that guy Oswald and we just missed him. Dick
Right,
Helms
right.
didn't say that in
Yeah.
his memoir. Nobody in the CIA literature says that. What they say is, we didn't know anything about the guy. And we
Yeah.
now know that that story is completely false, right?
Yeah.
They had 194 pages on him. Um, so, the argument that, oh, there's no smoking of proof. Look, these actions, CIA operations, are conceived and executed with plausible deniability in mind, right? You want to be able to leave a record so that you can plausibly deny your own involvement. And then the purpose of plausible deniability is actually to serve the president so that the president can plausibly deny US involvement in some dirty tricks or whatever the CIA is doing. So you know, Joannides' actions in 1963 are conceived with plausible deniability in mind. And the people who criticize my work, you know, they never seem to mention that. And they assume that I haven't thought of the arguments that they're talking about. You know, we have to choose. Which is more likely, that Joannides was completely ignorant of what his paid agents were doing in New Orleans when they did what he was paying them to do, and that he was completely ignorant, or that he was knowledgeable about that and approved? I mean, the bulk of the evidence suggests that the latter is true. He definitely knew about Oswald. That's not open. He was a highly qualified officer who was praised for, and this is a quote, the validity of reporting techniques. Okay, that's what he was praised for. So this is a guy who reported what his people were doing. The
Right.
assumption that he was ignorant, it's just an assumption with no evidence.
To me, it looks like they got the guy who knew where all the proverbial, bodies were buried to lead the search for the evidence. And he's like, I can't find anything on Oswald and Miami or James Wave or the DRE. So
Yeah,
back to you guys.
Matt, um, uh, the HSCA investigators, Gaten Fonzie was in Miami, Dan Hardway was in Washington, and his boss, Bob Blakey, was in Washington. They asked Joannides, it was a natural question, who was running these Cuban students at the time of their confrontation with Oswald? And Joannides got back to them and said, we don't know. And he himself was the answer to the question. So the audacity of that deception speaks to its importance. And this is another thing that the critics, so if Joannides was so ignorant and innocent, why didn't he say so? He
Right.
had a perfect opportunity. He could have told the HSCA, I wasn't paying attention to what those guys were doing in New Orleans. It wasn't, I didn't know about it. I mean, if that were true, he had a great true story to tell that would have exonerated the CIA and prevented people from me like coming on and saying, well, something else was going on here.
I,
No, he lied his ass off, probably a felony, according to Bob Blakey. And the whole story didn't come out for another 30 years. To then turn around and say Joannides is entitled to the presumption of ignorance and innocence, that's just an exculpatory reflex to make sure that, nobody says anything bad about the CIA. And so, the CIA's pro bono lawyers on, social media, and that's what they are. They're making the case that the CIA lawyers don't have to do, and they're making it for free because that spares the CIA from paying their own lawyers to make these arguments in public. So the CIA's pro bono lawyers seize on anything to exculpate their client, the CIA.
Sorry, who do you mean CIA pro bono lawyers? Like,
Mike Isikoff, Fred
yeah,
Litwin.
sure.
I leave Gerald Posner out of that because I respect Gerald's work. Gerald is a good journalist has done some very good books on a lot of subjects. I don't think Case Closed is a very good book. But Gerald is, I respect him as a reporter. These other people, they're pro bono lawyers. Mike Isikoff doesn't know anything about the JFK story. And he's up there, pronouncing, of course they were paying attention to Oswald. Mike Isikoff has never read the Oswald file. He doesn't even have a copy of it. Sure. And he's spouting off. And the reason that he spouts off is because he's a, big deal Washington Post reporter, or so he thinks. And, he's right. And if you disagree with him, you're stupid. That's his attitude. Well, it's not very convincing. Nobody's convinced by it. And, and the more evidence that comes out, their instinctive desire to protect the CIA, exculpate the CIA, they know that it's getting less and less credible.
Right.
So, they're trying to stick their fingers in the dike and say, oh, don't worry that we had 194 pages on Oswald. That's really nothing. I mean, Gerald didn't mention it in his book, and the Warren Commission never said anything about it, and nobody's ever reported it in a major newspaper until very recently. But the CIA didn't do anything wrong. Believe us.
Right.
It's just exactly. It's not very credible, and we are groping our way towards a new JFK narrative because these people have been discredited. And, anybody who's paying attention to the case can say, that doesn't really, explain very much. That doesn't
Yeah.
get at what we're learning. So I think we're making progress, especially in the past year with President Trump's order and Rep. Luna's committee. A lot needs to be done, but we're making progress.
Yeah, and I want to get to that real quick.
Yeah.
First, I just want to quickly touch on the Mary Ferrell litigation. So, Trump called for declassification generally. Obviously, we have the Luna Task Force separately, but we still have the JFK Records Act on the book. And I guess my biggest question for you is you're on the board, and this is I'm maybe putting you in a tough spot here, but you're on the board of Mary Ferrell. The attorney for Mary Ferrell right now, one of the attorneys, I believe, is Mark Zed, and he has sort of been critical of you on Twitter. How where
Well,
did
let me let me
you
let me
yeah,
like
can you unpack that conflict a little bit and sort
yeah.
of how that makes sense as him as counsel?
When Rex Bradford, the president of the Mary Ferrell Foundation, and I and board members were trying to figure out what we could do to break the logjam because the CIA had gotten to President Trump and then to President Biden and convinced them to keep withholding JFK records past the 2017 deadline that was written into the law. And it wasn't a small number of records. When it came to Trump in 2017, it was like 16,000 records still had redactions. And the CIA, most of those were CIA records, and the CIA was insisting that they remain public. And Trump caved, he didn't really care. And he gave the CIA everything they wanted. So they got 4 more years of secrecy. The question went to Biden in 2021, and he basically did the same thing. And so we were like, what can we do? And so we thought, well, we can sue. And so how do we sue the government? Well, Mark Zaid is a FOIA litigator with a lot of experience, and a friend of mine. And so, we asked him, what would you do? And so we had some brainstorming sessions with him, but he was never, and he had some ideas about how to deal with National Archives and thoughts about where the record applied and all of that. But he wasn't of counsel in the case.
Okay,
He
I
was
got
an
you.
advisor, and when he saw where we were going, he wasn't comfortable with it. He dropped out. So, now he's quite critical and sticking to the lone gunman story. I don't think it's warranted. I respect his judgment. I admire his defense of the cops injured in the January 6th riot. And I just, on this particular issue, I don't think he's informed. I think he's like a lot of people. He's locked into his position, and he doesn't want to change it. Okay, that's fine. I have a different view.
Let me throw one more JFK Records Act question at you. There's a provision in the act where it basically says that if these agencies knew that this act was about to be passed and is coming down the pike, if they turned over their records to the National Archives before the act was in effect, then they're outside the purview of the JFK records collection. And I
Mhm.
guess my general question to you is, so that's one example of records that may be relevant that we can't really get at. Um, do you think the best approach going forward is continued litigation or more of basically you asking Luna to ask the CIA director to give it to you? That seems to have worked
Well,
so far for some things.
yeah. Let me take those. Let me take those one at a time. So, you know, the JFK Records Act that were turned over before the board existed, they're not unknown. They're in the Archives 2 facility in College Park, Maryland. And the Mary Ferrell Foundation captured, Rex Bradford captured not all of those, but most of those. So those are documents that, to be very precise, um, they don't have what we call RIF numbers, right? The records that were processed by the JFK Review Board, they took each record and they gave it a unique record identification form number, RIF. And so we have RIF numbers for all of those, and we can track JFK, all the JFK documents. There's 319,000 of them that have different RIF numbers. So there are some documents in the collection that don't have RIF numbers, and they're harder to find and locate. Okay, so that's a problem. A second problem that's been identified by JFK researchers, including a couple of lawyers who worked on the early case, was this question of final determinations. And the review board for each record would make a final determination about would it be released or would it be released in part or withheld in full. And so what Andrew Eiler and these other researchers found was they went to the archives, found the final determination orders, and found that they were basically ignored.
Hmm.
And what their argument is that once the JFK Review Board made the final determination decision, then the rest of the government, then it was over. Whatever the Review Board decided, that was the decision of an executive branch agency and was final. And the agencies had to obey it. And so what the Trump and Biden orders on JFK records in 2017 and 2022 did was they basically said, well, the agencies can keep withholding this stuff. And the whole issue of final determinations, it wasn't even known, you know.
Hmm.
So so the issue of final determinations is an important one. The only question, the reservation I have now is, so what do you do about that, right? Like the archives and the review board should have been more vigilant and said, here's a final determination. This means the document has to be released on this date. But now that process was ignored or abused, what do you do about it? So when
Hmm.
I hear that story, it's like, okay, I have a relationship with Congressman Luna. I can go to her and say, here's a concern. Like, what could we do with that? What would be the action point around that? And I don't see like what you could do. Now, so what litigating around that question, what would it achieve? I'm not convinced that it would achieve anything. To your second point, so do we rely on Representative Luna asks the CIA for a document, she gets it and I make it public? That's not a solution either. We need to codify a process to find, locate, and release JFK records. And right now, Director Ratcliffe is being cooperative, and Representative Luna has been terrific in asking for documents and making sure that they get provided. And we've got three big examples of that now. So the Carlos Marcello file, FBI file, which had been identified by David Kaiser, a historian who had written a book about JFK, and he pointed that out to me. He said, the JFK Review Board never saw this FBI file on Marcello. Can you get it? I asked Representative Luna for it. She asked the FBI for it, and we got it. Okay, so that process can work, but it shouldn't be informal like this. There should be a standard procedure where government agencies, when notified of the existence of JFK records, review them and release them and send them to the National Archives. So I'm not happy that, with the Herminio Diaz file, which I obtained a copy of and is a public record, but hasn't been given to the National Archives. No, that's not an ideal situation. But I'm not going to sit on a JFK file
Sure.
because the CIA has failed to do its job. I'm sorry, I'm a newspaper reporter and I like to get a scoop. Okay. And the Herminio Diaz file showing that James Angleton was up to his eyeballs in vetting assassins for the CIA in October 1963. That's a scoop. That's a real story. So
Yeah.
I'm not going to hold back on that. But we need a better process. And I'm hoping that the House Task Force, in its final report, will make some recommendations about legislation to complete the disclosure process that President Trump has helped along a great deal with his executive order. But a lot more needs to be done to make sure that it really works.
Yeah, because just so to tie a bow in the records conversation, the final determination forms, what could be done in litigation, to the extent there are documents where there is a final determination form that says it's supposed to be released and it hasn't been released, you should be able to get those through a writ of mandamus. I mean, like it's pretty straightforward. It's just that there weren't that many of those documents. I think most of what Andrew found was documents where they were not released at the time they should have been released, but then subsequently they've been released, so it's kind of moot now. But there are a few documents that have not yet been released and did have final determination dates, I believe.
Okay, in that case, where you've got a document that was supposed to be released and still has redactions in it, absolutely.
Okay, yeah.
And I'll take that up with Rep Luna. You know, here's the final determination. This has to be made public, right?
Sure.
And that's what I like about that approach is here's a specific document that
Mhm.
should be released. Here's the specific reasons, legal reasons why it should be released. Please go get it. When you have that type of specificity right now, we can get results. Now, people come along to me and say, well, I need this file of, this guy who was friends with LBJ and there's 17,000 pages. You know, I'm not going to go to Capitol Hill and tell an elected official to tell the CIA to go search 17,000 pages of material. That's not the way Washington works. If you have a specific request, identify a specific record that exists, you can get results and we can get results and we are getting results right now. So I'm telling people, you have a specific suggestion of a JFK record you think should be out there. I will convey that, regardless of your theory and regardless of my theory. I'm not a gatekeeper. I'm a
Good.
journalist and I'm interested in full disclosure. If you have a contribution to make to full disclosure, please, let's have at it. Let's
Yeah.
get that done.
So, in terms of full disclosure, these records, how many? So, what's the state of the unreleased records? Because we've gotten some of the big ones, like you mentioned, and then Trump, he, disclosed a lot of them, but are there still like about 1,000 or so hanging out there?
This is something we're trying to determine at Mary Ferrell Foundation right now. I don't have a good number. I don't have a good grasp of that. We do know that based on, you know, documents that we knew that had major redactions in January and no longer have them, they've done a good job. This is massive declassification. And frankly, we still don't understand that we haven't mastered the new information, and or are only beginning to. Um, there's a lot of information that was made public about the Fair Play for Cuba Committee, and this is the direction where my reporting is going, because this is another area where even the review board was not informed about certain operations against the Fair Play for Cuba Committee in 1963, or they got information and never had a chance to assess its significance. And so there's a lot of information that has come out and has never been seen by all these people who say that there's nothing in there. There's nothing in there because you haven't read the documents, and you have these posturing reporters like Mike Isikoff at Spy Talk who pronounce on, JFK records, having never read them and having no experience in writing about the case at all. But because he's smarter than you and I, he feels free to say that you're stupid if you disagree with him, when in fact he hasn't even read the records. So
Right.
we're getting beyond that because there is a whole lot of information, and the people who are out there are saying, there's nothing there, there's nothing there. I mean, they've been saying that for 20 years, and you know what? It's boring, it's tiresome,
Mhm.
and it's unenlightening, and it doesn't conform with the facts. So we are making progress at getting the whole story, but how much is still withheld? This is why we need a process where
Right.
and you can identify a JFK record that's known to exist. There should be a process where you can make that known to the government agency. They can go look at their records, produce the record, and send it to the archives. So hopefully that is some legislation that comes out of the House task force process could do a lot towards, both clarifying the situation, reducing suspicion, uh, eliminating stupid conspiracy theories, of which there are many, and restoring public confidence that, hey, we're finally getting the whole story here.
So to that end, let's move on to the task force on declassification of federal secrets, led by Representative Anna Paulina Luna. Just a few questions there. So you were, I guess, I know you were one of the folks who testified on
Yeah.
April 1st. I was sitting there in between
Yeah.
Oliver Stone and you behind you guys. The gift that keeps giving. I was like, oh, I'm watching you on CBS Sunday Morning News. Oh, my kids are like, hey, Daddy, there you are. I'm like, that's right. Well,
Very good.
that can you just tell me a little bit about sort of how that all came together, and what's your hopes for where it ends up going?
Yeah, no, it's a good story. It's a good story. First of all, had never even heard the name Anna Paulina Luna until March of this year. And I was reading social media, and she had put out a tweet saying, we're going to have a House Task Force going to have a hearing in Dallas, and we're going to call living witnesses, and we're going to, and she got crucified on social media, like in a way that you rarely see. Okay. She put out this tweet, and within 24 hours, she had 10,000 tweets. And I would say, conservatively speaking, 98% of them were negative. It might have been 99%. I mean, and everybody, it was unanimous. We don't want to have another hearing, just release the files. Okay. So this was obviously not a good move on her part. So when I saw that, we had been, interested in what this task force was going to do. And I contacted her office with the help of a lobbyist friend. And I said, look, if you're going to do JFK files, you're walking into a minefield. Everybody's got their eyes on it. There's a million experts out there. Half of them are assholes. And you're just inviting trouble if you walk into this field not knowing what you're talking about. And she said, well, what should I be doing? So I said, well, okay, here's 15 records that have redactions in them, and why don't you go get them? And so she turned to her aide and she said, get Ratcliffe on the line, and we're going to give him a list of these documents. And I was like, whoa. I've been in Washington a long time. For a congressman to take direct action while I was speaking in relation to the CIA on the spot, that showed me that this woman had some nerve. It also showed me that, unlike most people in Washington, she wasn't cowed by the CIA. She wasn't intimidated by the CIA. She wasn't trying to flatter or curry favor with the CIA. She was looking at them like as a government agency that had a legal obligation to provide records, and she was going to do that. And so we began working together. And you know what? She's a MAGA red conservative. Okay. I read her social media feed. I cringe. Okay. She's also a terrific person, and she has been very good on this issue, starting from that first conversation when she said, call Ratcliffe's office and tell him we want a meeting. And she's delivered. She's learned from her mistakes. She's a quick study. She handled those hearings very well. And I point out, I'll tell you, watch the second House committee hearing on May 20th. Abe Bolden was the first witness, okay? A very important JFK witness, right? A CIA agent, a Secret Service agent, who notified the Warren Commission in the summer of 1964 that there were severe problems in President Kennedy's security detail in the weeks before the assassination. The next day, Abe Bolden was put under arrest and railroaded for a crime that he never committed and spent 6 years in jail. Okay? That alone tells you that the Warren Commission, the FBI, and the Secret Service weren't interested in a real JFK investigation, because they arrested a guy who was going to talk about Kennedy's security detail. He spent 6 years in jail. I said, when she said she wanted to have live witnesses, I said, you really have to have Abe Bolden. This guy really paid a price for trying to do the right thing. So Abe Bolden comes on. He's 92. I talked with his son and his lawyer to help, get him do this. And of course, there's these technical difficulties, and it's like, here's this old man. He's kind of bent over. He's having technical difficulties. And so Luna handles it very graciously, said, "We'll come back to you, Mr. Bolden." And they solved the technical problems. And then he came back and testified. And she handled that part. And then at the end, she apologized to Bolden in a very graceful way and thanked him for his service and apologized for the way the government had treated him. Okay. It was really a classy thing to do. And it really demonstrated her humanity to me. And, that's important. So, yes, we have political differences. Yes, those differences are very important. But on this issue, we don't spend a lot of time arguing about that other stuff because we have too many things to do on JFK. What records should we get? How should we do that? How are they going to respond? Is this realistic? All of those questions about how do we attack this problem of JFK disclosure, she's aggressive, smart, independent, and has made a difference. So I'm glad to work with her, and I will keep working with her. And I hope that, the task force has many things in its, orbit that they're supposed to take on. And now the Epstein files are sucking all the oxygen out of the room. But I hope that the House Task Force in its final report will both chronicle the progress that we've made towards full disclosure mandated by the JFK Records Act, and also some legislation to complete the process. So, I think so far those hearings were very positive, heard from important living witnesses, and we're obtaining new documents. And, we're going to need some legislation to finish it. But I think the House Task Force has been a good start towards that end.
So legislation to basically conclude the JFK Records Act, the intent of the JFK
Yeah,
Records.
I mean, to establish some kind of process going forward when new JFK records, and to the law prevents the disclosure of IRS material. So Oswald's tax returns are not in the public record. And then there's records in private hands, like the Manchester papers, that are covered by a deed of gift, and it will take legislation to break the deed of gift and make those documents public. So that's the remaining business that needs to be done. But the Trump administration posture, as it stands right now, has been cooperative and helpful. So we're making progress.
A related question there. So just in watching the two hearings, the Democrats on the committee, aside from the chair, Garcia, I believe his name is, the
Yeah.
co-chair, um, didn't seem to be super interested in the case. So
I know they seem not to understand that JFK was a Democratic president.
yeah, does it concern you? Does it concern you that the JFK assassination has sort of become or is at risk of becoming a Republican coded issue?
Absolutely, absolutely, and that's why I emphasize, and I tell Luna all the time, Anna, I'm kind of a Bernie Sanders guy. Okay, just so you know. And I say that because I've been pushing. Rex Bradford and I have been pushing for this since 2012, long before Trump went on the escalator. So no, this is not. But it does have that risk, and in this polarized environment, Democrats are shying away from anything that is seen as Trump friendly, and I understand that. Trump does act in bad faith, and has, and so reasonable people in the opposition don't trust him. But this is not a partisan issue. Understanding the causes of Kennedy's death is essential to understanding the predicament the country's in right now, I think. And that's not a partisan issue. And, if you look at who's interested in this, and I measure by my subscribers, they're very diverse. Subscribers to JFK Facts are not MAGA. I mean, there's a substantial minority that are, but not the majority. And you know what? We don't argue on the site about all of those other issues. The people who are MAGA or pro-Trump, anti-Trump, that's not what we're arguing about. We're focused on JFK records, and that's what matters. And it's not that the other stuff doesn't matter. It's that we're just going to put that aside for a little while and solve this problem. And, I couldn't have solved it. Rep Luna couldn't have solved it on her own. She took a lot of leadership and took some political risks in doing that, but that's been all to the good.
Yeah. Well, one more question on the Luna case,
Sure.
and I appreciate your time today. We'll be wrapping up here shortly, but what do you say to criticism that I've seen thrown at you on Twitter in particular that you're too focused on the Joannides file and why is he not bringing up the whole case at large? And kind of my answer to that is, well, I don't know. This guy's been studying it his whole life. Like, isn't shouldn't he talk about the thing that he knows the most about? But I don't know. You go ahead. How would you respond to that criticism?
I mean, the Joannides story that a CIA covert action officer was generating propaganda about Oswald before and after the assassination, and then illegally concealed his actions from a congressional investigation. That's the heart of the case, and we don't have an understanding of it. Now, why am I not talking about who was on the grassy knoll? I don't have new information about that. I'm a reporter. I'm reporting what's new.
Mm,
So, no, I don't look at the panoptic case. I look at what I know about and what we need to know more about. And so, I'm not saying the other things aren't important. I don't argue against people who say other aspects of the case are important. They are important. I totally agree with that. But with what I have and with the mandate of doing journalism, of doing news, I'm not writing history on JFK facts. I'm writing news. I'm writing what's new information. Now, when I write my book, which I've started, I will look at the case in a more comprehensive way. But you know, there's no need to do that now, given the pressing need just to do journalism.
so you're going to do a book. So is that going to be on Joannides?
It's going to be on CIA operations around Oswald.
Okay.
And Joannides is not the only one of those, but is probably the most important of those. So,
Well, that's exciting.
and explaining how that operation worked, I'm going to do that in a whole lot more detail than I can do online. And so the people who say, well, there's nothing there or we don't know, we need to fill out the story, because when you see the whole picture of who Joannides was, going back to when he joins the CIA in 1950, a story that hasn't been told, um, you will see that those kind of objections melt away and they're
Sure.
kind of irrelevant given what we know.
I can't wait to read that.
That's in the works now. I don't know when it'll be published, but yeah, the assumption in a lot of these online debates is like, you're an idiot, you're an asshole, you don't know what you're talking about, and it's like, no, I'm not an idiot. I'm not an asshole. I have a lot of information about why I say what I say. I'm not spouting off. I'm not pushing a theory. And I think most people see that. The CIA's pro bono lawyers online, like Mike Isikoff, they're very threatened because they didn't know any of this stuff, and now they've got to explain it. And it's
Mhm.
very difficult to explain when you don't know anything.
Yeah,
So they're losing credibility, and we're coming into, like, what's the full story? So I focus on one piece that's very important. That's not to scant that there are many important pieces that I have not addressed at all. That's
sure.
definitely true.
One last question.
Sure.
Um, you recently, maybe yesterday, I think, uh, came out with a new story on a new document that you alluded to earlier, the Herminio Diaz file. Could you just unpack what's significant about that and what your find was for everybody real quick?
So Herminio Diaz was a Cuban hitman. He wasn't really an organized crime figure, but he was the director of security at Meyer Lansky's casino in the Hotel Riviera in Havana. He'd been involved in political violence in the Cuban milieu since the late 40s. The CIA knew that he had been involved in a number of killings. Um, he was of interest to me because um, I interviewed Fabian Escalante, who was the chief of counterintelligence for Cuba in 1963, and kind of became the spokesman on JFK issues for the Cuban government for a while. And I interviewed him in Havana, And he told me the story of Herminio Diaz, which was Herminio Diaz had come to Cuba in May 1966 on a mission to assassinate Castro. The Cuban security forces had advance word that he was coming. And when he arrived, when his boat arrived, there was a huge shootout. A bunch of people were killed, including Herminio Diaz. The leader of that mission was a guy named Tony Cuesta, and he was blinded in the firefight. He was blinded by grenade shrapnel, but not killed. So the Cubans took him to jail and they interviewed him and said, what were you guys doing? What was going on here? And he told them that Herminio Diaz was on this mission to kill Castro. But he also said in the course of that he had come to believe Tony Cuesta, a friend of Diaz, an ideological ally of Diaz. Tony Cuesta told Escalante that he believed that Herminio Diaz had been a gunman in Dealey Plaza. And another witness came forward who had been in that jail also at the same time, a man named Martinez, who said he wanted to say something before he died, and that was that he had been childhood friends with Herminio Diaz, and he too believed that Herminio had been involved in JFK's assassination. So there was no corroboration of that, but these were two people who were friends with Diaz, who had independently come to the conclusion that he was involved in the assassination somehow. So I asked Representative Luna, I had found a file number for Herminio Diaz's 201 file, his personality file, kind of the basic file that the CIA has on people. And I said to her, ask the CIA to produce this. And they did. So my story is about that. Now, here's the thing. That file does not support the notion that Herminio Diaz was involved in JFK's assassination. It doesn't refute it. It just doesn't bear on it in any way. But that doesn't mean that it's not newsworthy. What the file shows is that it was Angleton's office who vetted Diaz as an assassin of Castro. When Diaz emigrated to the U.S. in the summer of '63, this is in the file, he told U.S. authorities that he was going to kill Castro and that he wanted to assassinate Castro and that he had friends in Cuba who could help him do that. So the CIA is immediately interested and they send word to Washington, to Angleton's office under the code name KU Desk. And they get back and they say, yeah, the Angleton's people get back to him and say, yeah, polygraph this guy. And so they polygraph him twice. They interview him 4 times and they polygraph him 3 times. So they're looking very carefully at, is this guy, could he kill Castro? And so all of that paperwork is going to Angleton. Okay. And a question like, are we going to take this guy on as an assassin? That question would automatically be referred to Angleton. Nobody was going to decide that in between. I mean, Angleton might listen to other people. He received the polygraph reports. And they eventually decided, no, we don't want to have anything to do with this guy. So the file does not have any relevance to the JFK assassination story directly, but it does show that Angleton was in charge of vetting assassins in October 1963. So that's part of the picture. That's part of the picture of what was going on. Before, we knew that Angleton had been involved in some discussions about assassination. Now we have documentary proof that he was actually, involved in a formal process of vetting assassins. So, that's part of the story. Is it a smoking gun? No, nobody ever said it was. In fact, what does it tell us about allegations that he was involved in the assassination of the president? Nothing. But what does it tell us about how CIA operations, assassination operations at the time of Kennedy's murder were run? Well, they were run by the guy who was controlling Oswald's file.
Right.
So, that's part of the story. And you can't take it away and you can't say, oh, it's not important. It's
Sure.
obviously important.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, hey, thanks for your work on that, and appreciate everything.
Well, Matt, thank you for giving me the time to go into this. I'm glad to respond to the critics. It's sort of a necessity because social media has a certain political reality. But I try and tell people, people say, well, where are the JFK records? And I'm like, bitching on social media is not going to get you anywhere.
Right.
Nobody in Washington's paying attention to your social media feed. It's like it's irrelevant. Um, Actually getting records, you got to show up in person. You got to show that you're trustworthy. You got to show you know what you're talking about. You got to, produce records. And then people in Washington, even people who have very different political views than you, they'll listen. And that's what I've been doing.
Sure. Yeah, yeah. My experience has been that anonymous Twitter handles especially they'll just throw bombs, and then when you respond, they'll go, "Oh wow, I didn't know you were going to respond. Big fan."
Yeah,
What are you talking
but
about?
that social media feed, I tell people, you know what this is? This is people arguing in a bar room before last call. It's like just loose talk. It's meaningless. And then the lights go up and everybody goes home and nobody cares. So it's important in a way, but it's not important in a
Sure.
way. And you have to keep that in mind as you're, you know, going forward in these discussions. But Matt, thank you for giving it the issue that, the time it deserves, because these 180 page, 180 character, fusillade exchanges on Twitter are meaningless.
Well, yeah, the whole thank you, and the whole point of my project here is to have every proposition of fact be footnoted. So just like in a legal brief, you have to set forth your propositions of fact, and while I obviously can't unknow what I know, I do want to present all the arguments in as fair a way as possible. So, yeah, I'm sure we'll talk again. I'd love to have you on again in the future, especially once I get into the CIA. I have not done that yet. It'll probably be
Is
next
that going
spring.
to be, is that on your schedule for your podcast?
Yeah, so like the whole thing was season one, it's like the basic first day evidence, like the 101. Season two is Oswald's life from birth to death, just a microscope on Oswald everywhere he goes. Season three is okay, if not Oswald, then who? Who are the culprits? So we got through Secret Service, and it's like, well, there's this guy Winston Lawson who's everywhere, pulling security everywhere, but we can't draw any lines, but it's one guy, Winston Lawson for the most part. And then FBI, well, it looks like Hoover had some level of foreknowledge, primarily because of the Mexico City conversation, which your colleague Rex Bradford did a nice job proving the tape was erased. But that's kind of it for Hoover. There's no like foreknowledge or planning on the Hoover side of things. LBJ, which I saw you get into a conversation with some folks. It's funny. Roger Stone, who I don't know Roger Stone. He's a famous guy, a political guy, but he started following me. Whenever I talk about LBJ, he just chimes in with a link to his book. And I'm like, dude, if you're going to do that every time I tweet about LBJ, you have to come on the show. So, but he hasn't responded in that regard. I found that the Mac Wallace and Madeline Brown stories were not compelling in my view. But I also
I
found,
agree. I agree with on both of those.
but I also found that there are so many tentacles of LBJ that it's hard to rule him out as having some level of foreknowledge. And the whole what gets me with LBJ is Hoover tells him, "Hey, there's somebody in person is an Oswald imposter in Mexico City at the Soviet Union." That never comes up again, even though Hoover follows it up with a memo. And then LBJ uses that information of his conversation with Hoover to pressure Russell and Earl Warren to be on the committee, even though he's saying something that he knows is false because Hoover told him it was an imposter.
Yeah.
That's
No, yeah.
yeah,
So, um, I just to visit LBJ for a second. You know, yeah, I think the foreknowledge, those stories that are recycled endlessly, when you look at them, they're very thin. They're not dispositive of anything. Um, but I think LBJ understood instantly what had happened, and that he needed to make sure that he didn't have to investigate his own government. And so, yeah, so he takes those actions, like you say, using false information to get the investigative committee under his control that he wants, which is the Warren Commission. So then after that, you're going to move on to CIA?
yeah. So LBJ, and then I'm going deep. I'm going deep. I'm going LBJ. I'm going next. I have the Mafia. That's my current mission that I'm deep in the research of now. And then I got Mafia. I've got CIA, the generals, and then I have to go Russia. I have to go Cuba. I have to, and then anti-Castro Cubans. But of course, it all starts to blend together. So it'll be hard to draw lines in some of these, but.
Yeah, no, I mean, and yeah. Well, I look forward. I look forward to it, Matt. And I would say that one thing, at the level of New Orleans or Miami, there's no functional difference between the CIA and organized crime. They're working together, and the role and Jack Ruby's role in the story to me is proof of the organized crime
Mhm.
role.
For sure.
And those propositions are not mutually exclusive, right? Remember another story that I broke on JFK Fags. The CIA station in Miami didn't believe the lone gunman theory. They investigated Cuban exiles the
Right.
week after the assassination. So that's yeah, these things blend together, when you get down to the reality of the story. But I look forward to your season. That's going to be good.
All right. We'll be in touch, man. We'll talk to you soon.
Okay, take care. Thanks a
All
million.
right. Thank you so much.